strange, almost unbelievable story of Robert Scott Carey began on a very ordinary summer day. I know this story better than anyone because I am Robert Scott Carey.
It was the post-Eisenhower. There was still a feeling of, I think, a residual angst about the war, nuclear threat. There was an attempt, I think, culturally to perfect the American family. I think male roles, female roles were very tightly prescribed. And it was a perfect storm, I think, in a way, as an idea for my father to explore all of those things through the experience of one man who becomes representative of masculinity not being so absolutely unassailable. His career was, I think, moving along, but there were financial pressures, and there were the pressures of being a new father, and there were the pressures of trying to determine what the next best step was going to be as a writer. There was certainly a lot of attention that was surrounding him for his talent. We rented a house in a little beachside community called Sound Beach. And it was off-season, so the prices were, very attractive. And my father would go down to the basement every day with a shawl, because it was still cold and musty down there. And he said he would convene with what he called his little man, and that was Scott Carey. He had gone to see a film, it was a musical called Let's Do It Again, with Ray Milland and Aldo Ray. And there's a moment where Ray Milland, puts on Aldo Ray's hat, which is too big for his own head, and it kind of comes down, sort of sinks down over his head. And that image was so arresting to my father that he thought, well, what if I were to take that idea and follow the story of a man who begins to gradually shrink?
I felt puny and absurd, a ludicrous midget. Easy enough to talk of soul and spirit and essential worth, but not when you're 3 feet tall. I loathed myself. Our home, the caricature my life with Lou had become. I had to get out.
I think my father was wrestling with a lot of personal questions about his life that bordered probably in some ways into a kind of an angst, and that had to do with, again, being a young father, taking care of his family. Could he depend on his writing career? And I think in some ways, as life can impose this on men, it can make you feel that you are being diminished. Even when things are going well, you can still have fears of your own kind of path, your own trajectory faltering, and that you feel that you're being diminished by the world. And I think that the book in that way, of course, is an absolute metaphor for what my father was going through.
Those reporters out there, why don't you tell them about it? Give a new angle for their papers. Or will I save it for my book? Yeah, that's what I'll do. A whole chapter devoted to telephones and one more joke for the world to laugh at.
Scott, people know, they realize they're not laughing at you.
They're not?
No.
Why not? It's funny, isn't it?
So he wrote the book. And I do know that when the book sold, he said to the studio, Universal, if you want it, I have to write the script. And he'd never written a script, but I think he knew he could do it, and they agreed to it. The dilemma that he was placed in was the book is told as a kind of a mosaic, if you will. It has flashbacks. It starts in the middle, then it goes back and forth between him being small and how he got into that position. The studio wanted it told in a linear fashion, and he never really felt that was the most compelling way to tell the story. So he had, ultimately that was what they did, but his version, his preference was to let it go back and forth. And I think what was so powerful about it in the novel is, and what the film didn't have, as good as the film was, that there was a kind of a juxtaposition of ironies that he was able to create by cutting back and forth. You know, the melancholy was still there in the film, but that juxtaposition was very important in being able to tell the story in a very particular way.
I had only to exist, to search out enough food to sustain me. I was driven by hunger, and also by the horrible thought that without nourishment, the shrinking process was quickening.
I think Jack saw in this book the very things that we're talking about, this idea of masculinity being a kind of a falsehood, a kind of a vulnerable construct. And I think he was very fascinated by that. He also was very protective, along with my father, about the ending of the film.
The antitoxin. They found it.
Oh, Scott. Are you sure?
Dr. Silva wants us down there.
The studio wanted there to be, I think, an ending where Scott Carey would be given let's say, a serum that would make him start growing again, thereby pretty much flattening the resonance and the depth of the story that they were telling. And I think Jack famously said, you know, over my dead body would I do that? And he had enough clout at the time that they were willing to at least test the ending that they came up with.
But even as I touched the dry, flaking crumbs of nourishment, it was as if my body had ceased to exist.
And my father would have loathed that ending. I mean, and not that the ending it's not nihilistic. It's not that the ending, though downbeat, the film, and dark, while the film is both those things, you know, it has that kind of strange metaphysical updraft at the end. And so the idea was not to make it a kind of a horror for Scott Carey and to condemn him to this misery, but rather that he moves into another dimension, another, you know, a sort of another landscape, whatever that might end up being.
With these bits of metal, I was a man again. If I was to die, it would not be as a helpless insect in the jaws of the spider monster. A strange calm possessed me. I thought more clearly than I had ever thought before.
And Jack understood that. Jack really, really understood that. And a different director might have said, well, you know, let's get him back into his life again. He's already lost so much. I mean, you can see where people would make that argument. But the better argument, the more I think resonant argument was to let him continue to get smaller and smaller. And of course that great line, "To God there is no zero," which is, you know, I think really sums up what the ending is all about.
I was continuing to shrink. To become what? The infinitesimal? What was I? Still a human being?
The novel itself is a fascinating thing for me to read, because I imagine my father down there in that basement, this young man who's raising children and building his writing career and dealing with, you know, his father had already passed away, and he was trying to find his way in this world. And I think, like so many young men, you're not allowed, you're not permitted culturally to acknowledge your own insecurities, your own worries, your own sense of being diminished by the world, by the fates, by your own poor choices. Women are, and women will support one another. Men cannot admit it to another man, so they have a hard time admitting it to themselves. And so, you know, they're in this weird kind of Mobius trying to kind of conceal. And I think what this book does is it really just takes those layers and it removes them one by one.
Again, I had the sensation of instinct, of each movement, each thought tuned to some great directing force.
It has really stood the test of time as a very, very mature piece of filmmaking. I mean, there are things about it you could pick on. You could pick on the special effects. You could pick a moment here or there if you wanted to, but I think there's a real kind of intelligence about it, and there's a real dignity about it. I think it's not a gimmick. It's not about the gimmick. That's what's so overwhelmingly clear. As profound as that gimmick is, or that device of shrinking, and it is as great a central image as one could possibly hope for in a dark fantasy novel. That's not the point.